Now, when Biddy Mason was born, she was already considered to be a slave, because in those days, you were a slave if your mother was a slave. That's how it worked. It didn't matter who your father was. It was inherited down through the mothers. That's how the rule was in the South, and Biddy Mason was born in the South. Her real name was Bridget, but they called her Biddy. Well, she ended up being enslaved by a husband and wife who needed somebody to help them because the wife actually wasn't very healthy. And Biddy, well, she had learned a lot as a child and as a teen. She had learned how to take care of people and animals. She was a midwife and a veterinarian. No degree, she just learned how to do these things. And she knew how to take care of a sick woman. And this wife was a sick woman. In addition, though, this husband and wife who had enslaved her, they became Mormons, and they decided to go west. When they got out to Utah, they had this idea. The Mormons had this idea of sending some folks to California, Southern California, near where San Bernardino is now. Now, there's disagreements on exactly what happened. Some say the Mormons said, you can't take slaves to California or they're going to be free. But the man who was taking Biddy there said, it'll be all right. And he took Biddy and a couple of other slaves with him to California. He tried to make sure that Biddy and the others didn't learn about California making them free. And by then, Biddy had children, and they came with her to California. Well, once they got to California, things didn't go very well for that family that had Biddy enslaved, but they stayed here for a while, and finally somebody said, this isn't really a good place for you to stay if you really want to keep slaves, because they're free here in California. You can't keep them that way. And besides that, you're not very successful as a farmer here in California. And the husband said, that's true, but this is too public a place. And so he took his family and Biddy and her family and the other slaves to a place that we call Santa Monica now. And they stayed up in a valley in the hill country there near Santa Monica. Now, it turns out that there was a young man who was fond of one of Biddy's daughters and wanted to marry her, and he found out that Biddy and her daughter were being held as slaves. And he said, you can't do that in California. And he talked to another man who was fond of the daughter of one of the other slaves there, and they said, we got to take this to the sheriff. And they took their word to the sheriff in Los Angeles, and he said, you're right, they can't keep slaves in California. And so he got a judge to swear out a warrant and to swear out a writ of habeas corpus to free them. Now, by this time, Biddy was being told, don't worry about it. You're not being treated so bad here, and we're just going to go back to Texas and we'll live just like we do here in California. And Biddy thought, well, all right. She didn't know anything about the plan to free her and her children. But when the sheriff showed up, they said, well, we were just going to, take them back to Texas with us. Now, the law in California was that if you brought somebody who'd been enslaved into California and then took them back to a state with slavery, they could be re-enslaved in the place you took them to. And Texas still had slavery. So the sheriff said, if you stay here in California, you could be free. And Biddy originally said, well, I don't know about that. And the man who'd enslaved her said, why, Biddy's just like family. She's not a slave. We're just taking her with us because she's family. And the sheriff said, "There are some things about the law you should maybe know." And so he took her to the courthouse and to the judge. Now, under California law at the time, African Americans were not allowed to testify in court, especially not against white people who were, say, the perpetrator of a crime or possible perpetrator. They weren't considered witnesses. But the judge, he took Biddy into his chambers and said, "I want to talk to you. Now, you may not care about yourself, but what about your children? If your children are taken back to Texas, they could be enslaved. Now, I can't allow that, so you can go back there with him if you want, but your children have got to stay here in California to keep them from being enslaved." And Biddy thought and said, "If I've got to be separated from my family just to go and be a servant someplace where I'm considered a slave, I don't think I want to go to Texas either." And so it was that the court decision was that Biddy and her whole family and the other slaves and their families were free. Well, that Mormon family went on back to Texas, but Biddy and her family, they stayed here. Biddy, now she used her skills, and one of the first things she did was use her skills as a midwife and offer herself to doctors in Southern California as a midwife to help women have their children, because that wasn't something that doctors really wanted to do unless there was some major problem. Now, the funny part was that one of the guys who hired her was a doctor who partly owned what is now Pasadena. A fellow named John Griffin was half owner of the land where Pasadena is now, and he was a staunch Southerner. He was pro-slavery. He even cheered when Abraham Lincoln was shot. But he knew that there were skills among African Americans, even the ones who were slaves. And he hired Biddy as not a servant exactly, but as an assistant, as a midwife to help deliver babies. She was good at it. She was helping people whenever they needed help. She would go around Los Angeles County to help deliver babies, and sometimes to help families who were too poor to pay for a doctor help somebody get well. And once she'd saved up a little bit of money, she bought land at the edge of what is now downtown Los Angeles. It was on Spring Street between 3rd and 4th. She bought a chunk of land there. And in her house was the first meeting of what became the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Los Angeles. She saved more money, and she taught her children about saving money and investing money. And so it was that she bought other pieces of land and sold pieces at a profit and rented pieces at a profit, but she made sure that that little piece of land on Spring Street stayed in the family. Well, by the time she died, she was actually pretty rich by the standards of the day. She had $300,000 in money and property around Los Angeles. Unfortunately, by the time she died, there was enough money involved that the members of her family got to arguing about it. And there was a dispute about who was going to inherit what pieces of the things that she had earned. She'd taught them about saving and earning, but not enough about sharing the way she did. You see, up until shortly before she died, folks would come and stand outside her house hoping that she'd be able to help them with their medical problems. And until she got too sick to do that, she would. They actually had to put a sidewalk outside her house to keep people from standing in mud. When she died, she was buried in an unmarked grave in one of the local cemeteries. In fact, she didn't get a gravestone until 1988, over 90 years after she died. But now there's something to remember her by down at the property that she owned on Spring Street. It's been turned into a little park Oh, not much, just some trees sticking up out of the concrete, and a wall where the story of her life is told. The Biddy Mason Memorial Park in Los Angeles is a little place, a special place, a place to remember a woman who was born as a slave and ended up as a free, rich woman who taught her children most of the lessons that she had learned. And so it is that we remember Biddy and her connections to Pasadena through the doctor who would hire her, Dr. John Griffin, a staunch Southerner who didn't like African American people much, but he knew that they could work and do a good job. And that's the story of Biddy Mason.